All right, I think we can go ahead and get started this evening. Let's go into screen show mode here. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit that operates out of the southeastern part of the state, actually based in Warminster, Pennsylvania. We've been in existence for 11 years, conducting primarily oral histories of individuals who were involved with Cold War related activities in the vicinity. But we also are involved with some historical preservation activities as well at the site of the former naval base known as the Naval Air Development Center. So I just have a few introductory remarks as usual, and then we'll turn things over to our guest speaker this evening. So this, of course, is what we call our History in Our Backyard webinar series. And I want to thank everyone, our loyal audience who attends these every month. I did want to just remind folks again, because we have gotten questions about whether we would be starting up live programming again. For those who have been longtime participants in these programs, we've previously had several live events at the Fuge, which was the site of the old Johnsville Centrifuge at the former Naval Air Development Center in Warminster. We're hoping to restart some limited live programming in 2022. I'm actually starting to work on our 2022 lecture schedule at this point, and I'll be determining basically where I may be doing some live programming in 22. But we will be also continuing our webinars as well. They have been quite successful, and one of the advantages of the webinars is that we can reach out to a broader audience across the US and occasionally internationally. So we will be, if anything, I guess, extending our programming for both webinar and live programming. So more information to come on that fairly soon. I also want to remind people, even though we're talking about one X-plane this evening, one particular X-plane, I did want to remind everyone about the first X-plane, the X-1, the Bell X-1. Today is the anniversary of the breaking of the sound barrier on October 14th, 1947. Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in this actual airplane. These are some actual photographs I took at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington when they were in the midst of a reconfiguration update to the so-called Milestones of Flight gallery several years ago. And actually, it was pretty exciting to see a number of their famous artifacts actually close up and actually on the ground. And this was one of the rare times that the X-1 was not suspended above us at the museum. So just wanted to mention that in case anyone has forgotten about breaking the sound barrier. The other thing I wanted to mention with regards to the Fuge, which is where we've actually conducted our live events, is that they're actually going to be opening up a brewery and a pub. They are going to be making their own beer, and I understand they may also be offering wine as well, that may be their own creation. So more information on that coming in early 2022. So I thought that was actually a pretty exciting development I wanted to let people know about. I also wanted to just give a quick, plug. As a nonprofit organization, we certainly operate on a shoestring and have some modest requirements, mostly for things related to supporting guest lecturers who come out of town, and speak on webinar like this evening. We also have a long-term desire to actually get a number of our interviews transcribed to add to our growing archive of oral histories. In the past, when pre-pandemic times, we have on occasion done some local displays, and we also have some modest requirements for website maintenance. But if you do, please keep us in mind for a donation. If you're thinking about making donations to a nonprofit organization, you can actually very easily connect your Amazon account to something called smile.amazon.com, which allows a little bit of your purchases to be donated to our organization. They're basically matched through Amazon, but we also take direct donations as well. And for those that are on this call this evening who have donated to the organization, I do want to very much thank you for that. We have a couple of additional programs to round out this year. Again, all webinar. This evening, of course, we have Michelle Evans, who I'll introduce in a moment, speaking about Mike Adams. But we have David Stumpf, who actually presented back in June with Greg Devlin on the Titan missile program. He will actually be returning in mid-November to talk about the Minuteman missile program. He just had a book published on the Minuteman this year. So looking forward to that. And then finally, to round out our webinars for 2021, we're going to have a panel discussion with a number of individuals who are involved with actually either writing or performing research or operating the old dynamic flight simulator or Johnsville centrifuge. So very much looking forward to that in December. We do record these webinars and they will be available on our YouTube channel following the conclusion of each program. We do have some other content that we pretty regularly add to the YouTube channel as well, so would encourage you to check that out. We also have a Facebook page in case you needed some access through that social media platform. We do try to keep that site updated primarily with our programming, but occasionally with some other news articles related to Cold War topics. And here's, as I mentioned, our next webinar will be with David Stumpf talking about the Minuteman program. Another thing I wanted to mention to everyone is that we do have a loose affiliation with the Cold War Museum in Virginia, and they also have a webinar series. I've had the opportunity to listen into several of these events so far. They've all been terrific. If you're interested in getting on their email distribution list, definitely would encourage you to email Jason Hall, his email address that you see there. They do charge a nominal fee to participate in those webinars, and they're on Sunday afternoons, so pretty easy to do. On a Sunday, if I guess maybe if you're not watching football this time of year. This is a list of the number of upcoming programs that they have. The next one that's coming down the line is actually with Marvin Kalb. I'm pretty interested in hearing that talk. Again, just to give you a little teaser on that, but you can also go directly to the Cold War Museum website and you can find information about their webinar series there. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker this evening, Michelle Evans. Michelle is actually a return speaker to this webinar series. Webinar/lecture series. Michelle is the founder of Mach 25 Media and is a writer, photographer, and communications specialist in aerospace. Michelle has an aerospace engineering background, which includes serving in the U.S. Air Force, working on missile systems, and later in private industry, accomplishing environmental testing for systems used in airliners and spacecraft. Her current work primarily involves exciting audiences about space exploration by speaking about the X-15 and other areas of the space program at venues across the country, as well as overseas and via webinars we have this evening. And Michelle is also the author of the terrific book, The X-15 Rocket Plane Flying the First Wings into Space, that was published by the University of Nebraska Press through their Outward Odyssey series in 2013. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the podium over to Michelle. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow her to share her slides, and we'll get started. So thanks again.
Hey, wait, not letting me in.
There we are.
And also, if everyone could kindly mute their lines, or I will have to mute you, just so we can have unfettered audio access to Michelle.
Okay, there we go. Everything's working. All right. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. I love being here. Wish I could be there at the Fuge with you and everybody, but
Hi, I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow.
oh, there we are. But anyway, yes, thank you for having me on your webinar series. It's really great to be here and to be able to do this for everybody, even though we're not there in person. I wanted to tell you about the story of Major Michael J. Adams of the United States Air Force. He was an exceptional research pilot and astronaut on the X-15 rocket plane, the fastest and highest X-plane that ever took to the skies. Adams was the first American astronaut who lost his life during a space flight, and yet he is little known today. He was a family man with a beautiful wife and 3 children, and I hope that after today you will remember Mike Adams for his part in America's early efforts in space exploration. Freda Adams made a point of attending each flight of the X-15 with her husband, Mike, which he flew for the United States Air Force. She recalled the first one, saying, "It was scary, but exciting. It was like being part of Flash Gordon." Freda watched what preparation she could. They would bring us out in a trailer and get us up pretty close. You'd watch him walk across to get into the X-15. She waved at him in hopes that he could see her, but knew that once in his pressure suit, his visibility was very limited. "I was always standing there wide-eyed. I can still see him walking out slowly because in the suit, he had to walk kind of like a robot." And once her husband entered the X-15, preparations continued. Eventually, the B-52 spooled up its engines, taxied away, then sped down the runway and off into the desert sky. While the lumbering bomber headed for the point on the map where her husband was dropped away to start his X-15 research flight, Freda was then taken back to the NASA control room where she watched the bulk of the mission unfold. Once the flight was over and the ground crew had helped Mike from the X-15 cockpit, she hitched a ride back out to the lake bed in order to greet him. "It seemed to me I was out on the lake bed most of the time, but nothing but big space and all that activity going on out there." Now, Mike Adams became the 12th and final X-15 pilot to enter the rocket plane program. He made 7 research flights, matching NASA pilot Neil Armstrong. Hope everybody here remembers Neil. Adams served the shortest amount of time at just over 13 months from his first flight to last. He was born Michael James Adams in California's capital city of Sacramento, California on 5 May 1930, staying at his hometown from grade school at Donner Elementary through 2 years at Sacramento City College before leaving to join the military. His younger brother George remembered, "When we were growing up, we did all the simple things in the neighborhood. In the summertime, we played kick the can and mumble peg and went to the matinee movies on Saturdays. It was a modest upbringing, but we enjoyed it." Mike's first job came while attending Stanford Junior High School, delivering newspapers on his bicycle for the Sacramento Bee newspaper. Mike also spent time playing with his best friend, Charles Gerdell, who eventually recommended Mike to Frank Sims at Sims Hardware for a second job during their first year in high school. Working at Sims gave Mike a lifelong taste for the outdoors, especially target shooting and hunting. Another area where Mike excelled was high school theater, which earned him a special mention in the Sacramento High yearbook. He won a leading part in the drama club senior play with the Judge Henry Wilkins in the romantic comedy Dear Ruth. And outside of dating and hunting, he also enjoyed many other hobbies, such as fixing up old cars. In 1949, Mike acquired a 37 Chevy to rebuild with one of his pals. George said he worked on it for the better part of a year. It was prime. Talking about Mike, you could easily see that George always looked up to his older brother. He wasn't real talkative, but I think he was liked and respected by those who knew him. Growing up, we slept in the same bedroom and he'd tell me ghost stories, which was pretty heavy stuff. At almost the same time, Mike completed his second year at Sacramento City College. The Korean conflict broke out. Mike was a prime candidate to be swept into the Army, so he made an end run around the draft by promptly enlisting in the Air Force. And after completing basic, Mike applied for Officers Candidate School. 2 years later, on 25 October of 1952, Adams graduated from pilot training school at Webb Air Force Base in Texas. He was then shipped off directly to Korea in April of '53, where he flew the F-86 Sabre fighter bombers for a total of 49 missions during the war, earning him an Air Medal in the process. And returning stateside duty changed his personal life forever when he met Frida Beard, a self-professed Southern belle. He came back from Korea and went to England Air Force Base in Alexandria, Louisiana, Frida told me. That's where I was living. My brother set up parties in order to try to get us together. Mike succumbed to the pressure and called Frida for a date. She remembered that he asked her for a movie on a Wednesday night, then said, well, if we don't like each other, at least we didn't waste the weekend. Frida laughed so hard she said she nearly fell on the floor, but agreed to go to the movie. After 2 years, Frida believed Mike was going to pop the question over the Christmas holidays, but he was clueless and afraid to gun instead. She wasn't really enamored with the Frida told me he loved flying, teen, and family, almost in that order. But Mike finally got her hint and proposed soon after the New Year. We married in January 1955, and not long after he had to leave on a 6-month tour to Germany. When he returned, it was like a stranger had gotten off that airplane. He came back and we had to get to know each other all over again. Once Adams had returned from Germany, he pursued his military career in earnest. First up, he was heading off to the University of Oklahoma for his aerospace engineering degree. This was also where Mike and Frida's first child, Mike Jr., was born. And next up for Adams was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for advanced study in astronautics, and also where his second son, Brent, came on the scene. He returned to Air Force duties at this point, being assigned to Chanute Air Force Base, Illinois, as an instructor. Their third child, Lise, joined the family there. George also spoke of a special pet that Mike took home to the family on one of his trips. When he was out here on a Christmas vacation, he'd flown to McClellan, which is near Sacramento, California, and the family acquired their first dog. Mike had bought a Brittany Spaniel. He put it in a cardboard box and tucked it in behind his pilot's seat and flew home. Mike's son Brent explained further. I remember my dad trying all the time to make him into a bird dog. My mom named him Tripod because us 3 kids kept fighting over whose dog he really was. Now, Mike was selected to attend the experimental test pilot school, where he was singled out for his flying excellence and as the best scholar of Class 62C, earning him the prestigious Hunts Trophy. He then moved on to the Aerospace Research Pilot School, also known simply as ARPS, as a member of Class 4. Adams graduated with honors in December of 1963. Now, with 2 astronaut groups already chosen by this time, Mike and his ARPS classmate, Dave Scott, applied for the 3rd group. For a while, it appeared they might both make the cut. They had flown out to Brooks Air Force Base near San Antonio, Texas, in order to undergo medical evaluations. Then Mike and Dave jetted to Houston for interviews at the new Manned Spacecraft Center. The process was going very smoothly. When they returned to Edwards Air Force Base in an F-104 Starfighter, their jet engine lost most of its thrust. Adams told Scott that if they hit, he would eject. Scott pulled the nose up to flare out for landing, but the back end of the F-104 struck the ground. Adams did as he said he would, safely punching away from the accident. Scott, however, stayed with the crippled craft, and in a serendipitous turn of events, both pilots made exactly the right decision. At impact, the jet engine was rammed forward, smashing through where Adams's seat had been just moments before. Mike would have been crushed if he'd stayed with the aircraft. Scott saved his own life by choosing not to eject. The investigation showed his seat was damaged when the F-104 hit the desert, and if he tried to eject, he would have been killed. Now, ejection is a severe process, and Mike ended up with some temporary back problems, which took him out of the running for that astronaut class. But Dave Scott did get picked and went on to fly into orbit on Gemini 8 with former X-15 pilot Neil Armstrong, and then to walk on the moon as commander of Apollo 15. How did Mike react to the news of losing the astronaut slot? Frida recalled he was very stoic, no comment. Even with no words spoken, she could tell how deeply the loss of the NASA astronaut slot affected him. It was at that moment all her reservations disappeared about Mike's goals of becoming an astronaut. I wanted to know, why was he not chosen? It was a disappointment for me, and I'm sure it was a bitter disappointment for him. Having missed at NASA, Mike then applied to the Manned Orbiting Laboratory Program, or MOLE. The spacecraft used a modified two-man Gemini, which would be connected to an orbital module full of surveillance equipment. It was a military spy platform on orbit and could have become America's first space station. MOLE had been an attempt to create a standalone military presence in space. Adams became one of the MOLE astronauts announced on 12 November of 1965. He's all the way at the left in this photograph. Right from the start, MOLE came under fire for militarizing space. Unmanned spy satellites were one thing, but adding astronauts, that was a different matter. Political niceties aside, the Cold War was raging in full force. In that climate, the Air Force continued to garner lukewarm support for the continuation of the manned laboratory. Political haggling was left to those in Washington, D.C. At the Adams home, Frida immediately saw a difference in her husband after his astronaut selection. She said, everything was really exciting when he was chosen. Unfortunately, though, it didn't take long for Mike's elation to fade as he figured out that his ride into space with the Air Force might be a long time coming. Mike's brother George said he definitely wanted to do more flying than he was doing, but he had at least gotten on to MOLE. Mike expected the fast pace of Apollo. Instead, the only fast-paced thing in this program were the delays. From the beginning, launch dates got farther away, not closer. Mike's boredom was palpable, and he felt he had to move on. George told me, when that spot opened up on the X-15, Mike jumped at that. Barely 8 months after joining the astronaut team on the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, Adams departed for the X-15, officially joining the rocket plane team on 12 July 1966. He was elated to get flying toward space in the X-15 as soon as possible, saying in an interview, "I'm not particularly anxious to set any records, but if there are any, that's just a cheerful fact that goes with the mission. The speeds and altitudes exceed anything I've seen before." His move away from MOLE was definitely the right one, as the program was shut down without ever achieving a manned flight. Once he shifted to the X-15, Mike perked up again. Frida explained it was like living in a unique world because that was a special thing. They treated you differently. The excitement from his wife and brother was much more visible than from Mike himself. Mike wasn't subject to opening up too much about things, recalled George. He summed up his older brother saying, quietly competent. If you didn't ask him a lot of questions, you weren't going to find out a lot. Frida explained Mike's single-minded purpose. When he set his mind to something, he did not waver. It would get done. Adams went to work preparing for his first X-15 flight. On 6 October 1966, Mike Adams was ready to launch, the first step on what he hoped would finally be his road into space. Heading toward Nevada, Adams and X-15 number 1 were firmly attached to the mothership's right wing pylon. The launch lake was just inside the California border at Hidden Hills. After the turn to get the flight under the correct heading back to Edwards, Adams dropped away from B-52 number 3. It was less than a second after launch for Adams to get the rocket engine out of idle and to push forward on the throttle. The joy of that flight was tempered in less than 90 seconds when the LR-99 rocket engine quit more than 30 seconds early. With 90 seconds on the mission clock, rules dictated Adams had to land short of Edwards by going into Cuddyback Dry Lake. The control room, also known as NASA 1, radioed, "Okay, Mike, you look in real good shape." Adams replied, "Looks like I could make it all the way to Edwards." The controller made sure that the rules were understood. "Let's make it Cuddyback, Mike," he said. Even with the emergency landing, Mike's demeanor was unfazed as he said, "This thing is fun to fly, even if I had to go to Cuddyback." Adams made a perfect centerline touchdown about a half-mile into the 3-mile-long dry lake bed runway. Fellow X-15 pilot Bill Dana praised Mike's performance during the emergency. "He did an excellent job with that. You could tell by the way he was talking that he wasn't uptight about having to go into a strange field on his very first flight." Now, the second flight for Adams on 29 November was for further familiarization with the dynamics and handling characteristics of the X-15. He expanded his speed envelope to approximately Mach 4.5 by increasing the engine thrust from 50 to 75%. The increased power of the LR-99 rocket engine was evident in that his higher velocity was achieved even though the burn time was reduced by a full 30 seconds. Unfortunately, winter weather and wet lake beds put off further flights for anyone on the X-15 for nearly 4 months. Drier weather finally permitted flights to resume on 22 March, where he was finally able to open up the throttle to 100%, recording his highest speed flight in the X-15 at Mach 5.59. That's 3,822 miles per hour. Launch this time was from Mud Dry Lake area, nearly twice as far from Edwards as his first 2 missions. The next flight for Adams expanded his altitude experience up to 167,200 feet. By 15 June, and after 3 successive aborted attempts, Adams was ready for a much larger leap in altitude, topping out at 229,300 feet. With the extra altitude also came extra time at 0G as the aircraft drifted through its ballistic arc at nearly Mach 5. Adams got somewhat annoyed by one aspect of having no gravity to hold things in place. My checklist would keep flopping up and over and it was waving around in front of me. I kept knocking it down, but it immediately would stand straight back up. So I finally just quit fighting it. Mike allowed the pages to do as they wanted until gravity returned as he began his reentry. After a successful reentry from 43 miles high, Mike set up on final approach to the Rogers Lake bed. After landing, he said, "Compared to what I could do in the simulator and what I was doing in flight, I wasn't doing quite as well as I should. Maybe we should fly more often." Mike still craved a more aggressive flying schedule. After all, this is why he had left Mole. Now, it took more than 2 months for Adams to get back into the X-15 cockpit. So, of course, he was a little ticked because he wasn't flying as much as he wanted. But he finally got ready for flight number 362. Even though it had taken too long by Mike's reckoning, he was certainly ready to go. It was the first time since entering the program he accomplished 2 back-to-back flights with no aborts in between. On 25 August, Mike got ahead on his checklist and was obviously anxious to get underway. Adams went for the launch, saying, "I hit the switch and I threw the throttle on as fast as I could, and I got a vibration malfunction shutdown." The X-15 continued its unpowered drop toward the ground as Mike ran through his restart checklist. 16 very long seconds later, and more than 4,000 feet lower in altitude, the familiar hard acceleration of the XLR-99 rocket finally kicked in. Adams compensated for most of the altitude loss at launch, leveling out just 600 feet below the planned 85,000-foot target. Coming down quickly, he prepared to land, later telling his debriefers, I don't know where I touch down. It just goes and goes and goes. The thing really floats. You can hold it off for a long time. It's a good airplane. As the dust on the lake bed began to settle and the friction of the skids brought the aircraft to a full stop, the clock read 1:35 p.m. on the afternoon of 25 August of 1967. After 6 flights, Mike Adam felt he was just getting the feel of this rocket plane. He looked forward to new and more meaningful missions, and he still had his sights set on space. He had no way of knowing he had just completed his final successful mission on the X-15. Moving to Edwards from Louisiana had originally been a shock for Frida. She had been raised amid the lush green and muggy air of the bayous. There was life everywhere. The high, dry desert of California seemed like being dropped onto Mars. I got there and I felt this is the end of the world. But then I finally learned to love it. She found the climate and stark beauty of the area had a lot to offer. The 3 children, all born in different states as their father moved from assignment to assignment, seemed to thrive from the adventure of it all. For the senior Adams, it was a new place to explore as he found not only the desert, but the nearby mountains and rivers. Frida said, "It was just a real fun time. We had good friends. He would love to ride through the countryside. We saw more strange areas that no one else could ever see or find. We go up into Tehachapi and see these strange looking quail, or up to Kern County where there was this beautiful stream. Wherever Mike was, he wanted to be outdoors." Adams also loved his music. Frida remembered he played the guitar, played the piano, and the accordion. He was talented. The kids used to play in bands, and we used to say they got it all from their dad. They don't get far away from their dad and his achievements or his life. Mike rarely spoke of his flights or his work on the X-15. For the most part, he was regarded as a very serious man. Mike's brother George said, he had a really good sense of humor. He just didn't expose it unless you brought it out in him. This was exemplified in another photo from his day at Edwards. At a time when wet lake beds forestalled X-15 flights, Mike expressed his displeasure at not flying by having this image snapped standing on a rain-soaked dirt umbrella over his head. But an even better indicator of his dry sense of humor was shared by fellow X-15 pilot Pete Knight, who talked of Mike having to leave Edwards for a few days, then asking Pete to drop by his house and water his plants. "So," Pete said, "I went over to the house, got the water bucket out and walked around. Every plant in the house was plastic." In October 1967, Adams stopped off to see his family in Sacramento and decided to take a quick outing with his childhood buddy, Charles, who told me, "We took my dad's boat out. We were sitting out there waiting for the fish to bite, and Mike said, 'You know, I'm flying faster than those bullets coming out of a gun.' It was just fascinating to hear him say that. That was when I last saw Mike." Pete Knight took the X-15 to the highest speed on 3 October 1967, achieving Mach 6.70 or 4,520 miles per hour. This is a speed record that still stands today and is considered by many to be the zenith of the X-15 program. 4 years earlier, NASA pilot Joe Walker had taken the X-15 to a height of 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles, about 10 times higher than your average commercial airline flight. Went into space, setting a record which was not beaten until 2004. Since the first flight by North American aviation pilot Scott Crossfield on 8 June 1959, the X-15 had been flown by a total of 12 NASA, Air Force, and Navy pilots on 190 research missions. It was a successful and mature program, one that everyone thought was well understood, and dare it be said, routine. Aircraft number 3 went into final preparations, culminating with closeout of all systems on 13 November. The weather was not favorable, causing a one-day delay before being mated to B-52 number 8. X-15 tail number 66672 was finally ready to launch on flight 3-65 on the morning of Wednesday, 15 November. Colonel Joseph P. Cotton spooled up the B-52's 8 jet engines and began his taxi onto the Edwards runway. In the right seat was Squadron Leader John Miller on temporary assignment from the Royal Air Force. This was Cotton's 12th time piloting the mothership for the X-15 and Miller's second as co-pilot. Jack Russell was in his position as launch panel operator, seated near a bubble window about the midpoint on the right side of the B-52's fuselage. Mike Adams was sealed into the X-15 cockpit, mounted under the right wing. At 9:13 a.m., the B-52 and its X-15 cargo lifted into the air and headed outbound. Adams was just along for the ride at this point, saying over the radio to Chase 1, "I'm just a tourist." The B-52 and 2 chase aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Fred Cuthill and Hugh Jackson from NASA, proceeded northwest toward the Delamar Dry Lake launch zone. Cotton noted they reached their cruising altitude of 45,500 feet faster than normal due to an outside temperature of minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. As launch time approached, Jackson moved Chase Plane 2 into launch position about 100 feet to the left and behind the X-15, while Cuthill and Chase 1 moved directly off the B-52's right wing to obtain photo coverage of the drop and climb out. The launch master switch inside the B-52 was activated, allowing Adams to now control his own drop. Pete Knight called from NASA 1, "Looks good here, Mike." Adams responded, "Roger, 2, 1, launch." At 10:30 and 7 seconds, he commanded his launch release. Falling away from the pylon, he immediately moved the LR-99 engine throttle to 100% thrust. NASA 1 confirmed, "Roger, we got a good light here, Mike." The X-15 quickly outpaced Cuthill and Jackson in the chase planes. Adams angled upward through the stratosphere, heading to the top of his ballistic arc in the mesosphere. This configuration of X-15 number 3 had 2 6-foot-long pods mounted to the tip of each wing. On the left were 2 experiments which opened at high altitude. One was a micrometeorite collection box, while the other was a solar spectrum measurement device. The right tip pod held an extendable probe known as the bow shock standoff measurement experiment. This probe had not been verified in an altitude chamber prior to flight, and in vacuum, it started to arc, causing noise in the wiring of the X-15. This affected operation of several critical systems, including the aircraft's computer, which started to continually dump and reset, a total of 61 times before the end of the mission. Adams tried to fix the problem, but it kept resetting, causing a major distraction as the flight progressed. Telemetry received on the ground showed Adams was on the flight profile, although they could tell his trajectory was just slightly higher than planned. On the ground, they had no idea that the distraction of the computer was causing a second major problem. An instrument on the X-15's cockpit was set to measure different things based on a switch position. Mike had switched it from reading yaw to roll, then apparently forgot due to the repeated computer glitch. So he kept reading it as yaw. At peak altitude, he hit 266,000 feet, and seconds later, he had inadvertently started to yaw the X-15 out of heading, quickly reaching 18 degrees to the right of his flight path. Nothing in the control room showed this deviation, so no one knew to tell Mike of the mix-up. Adams continued to try and center the needle, magnifying the out of attitude yaw movement to the side. As he started to head back down toward the atmosphere, the yaw rate sped up. In 18 seconds, he was at 28 degrees. After 36 seconds, he passed 90 degrees. And just 47 seconds after it started, he had rotated the X-15 a full 180 degrees. In other words, the X-15 was now pointed directly backwards along its flight path. Air started to bite into the wings and tail surfaces. Because of the reverse orientation, it quickly put the X-15 into a hypersonic spin, which lasted for 43 seconds. Such a condition had never been envisioned. No other aircraft before or since has ever been in a hypersonic spin. Mike tried to correct the spin using the reaction control jets. He called over the radio to Pete Knight. "I'm in a spin, Pete." Knight didn't seem to understand, and Mike repeated the call 2 more times before going silent. NASA One continued to call on the radio, never envisioning the disaster unfolding high in the desert sky. Mike may have blacked out from the G-forces spinning him around at a high Mach number. When the X-15 came out of the spin at 120,000 feet, it was once again facing into the direction of flight. But a severe up and down porpoising motion at Mach 4.7 began, inflicting 15 Gs on the airframe. This quickly exceeded the aircraft's structural limits. At approximately 80,000 feet, the X-15 started to break apart from aerodynamic loads, with the entire structure failing by the time it descended to 62,000 feet. At 10:35 and 20 seconds, just 5 minutes and 13 seconds after dropping away from the mothership's wing pylon, X-15 number 3 impacted the desert floor in a hilly area between Johannesburg and Ridgecrest. Mike was killed instantly. As is obvious from the flight radio transcripts, those in the control room and aircraft aloft supported the mission had no idea of the severity of the events unfolding. Even though Adams radioed 3 times in just 17 seconds that he was in a spin, it appears to have never fully registered to those on the ground. Even at this point, most everyone expected that Mike had somehow either made an emergency landing or had ejected. It took 10 minutes for someone to see signs of the crash. A helicopter was dispatched where they found the forward fuselage and confirmed the worst. At 11:01 a.m., the flight surgeon made the radio call, dispelling any doubt of a possible miracle. This day started no different for Frida from all the other X-15 flights when her husband was the pilot. She was at the NASA Flight Research Center watching the proceedings. Also joining her was Mike's mother, Georgia. She was in town to spend the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday with Mike and Frida and her 3 grandchildren. This was the first time Georgia had an opportunity to see her son doing the job which made him famous back in Sacramento. Frida sat quietly with Georgia in the NASA control room, not wanting to get in anyone's way as the flight proceeded. But soon after she heard the fateful call from Mike, "I'm in a spin, Pete," she knew something was wrong. Almost immediately, even as events continued to unfold, someone had the presence of mind to realize Frida and Georgia should no longer be in that room. She recalled, "We were standing, listening, and of course, everything was going awry. They quickly got us out of there. I can remember I wanted to help Georgia. I wanted to be sure she was protected from whatever. So I was trying to be the mother hen to her when I was probably falling apart myself." Several of the people I spoke with expressed grave misgivings about the X-15 program following the tragedy. This stemmed from how they felt the program had somehow lost sight of its objectives. Harry Shapiro, an engineer on the external tank system, said, "North American was very concerned there was a lackadaisical manner about the way the people were starting to handle the aircraft. I think the company felt we were going to lose more if we had this manner. We really had to treat each flight as a critical item." X-15 pilot Robert White shared the same sentiment, saying, "I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing. Boy, that's not routine stuff. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this." There was this stupid dual instrument presentation. You'd flip a switch and it would show you something happening, and you'd flip it another way and the same needle would show you something else. I thought, give me a break. That NASA is a different kind of NASA than the one that I operated with. In the context of the opinions of both Shapiro and White, it can be argued that the historical roots to the later Challenger and Columbia space shuttle disasters can be seen as early as 1967 with the Adams accident. In the investigation for all three, people can go back and say they saw the problems beforehand, yet no one was able or willing to step forward to get the attention of those who could have broken the chain of events before they spiraled out of control. The traversing probe experiment in the X-15's wingtip pod produced electrical problems because it had never been tested in vacuum and was the ultimate root cause of what happened that fateful day. Yet instead of questioning this lack of testing, someone assumed that since it had been flown before, then that was good enough. It was stated in both space shuttle loss investigations, the deviation from normal was accepted as being the new normal. Any variance from expected parameters should never be considered routine and certainly not as normal. Good people died in all three cases because of complacency and not wanting to be the one to stand up and say anything was wrong. Directly as a result of the Adams accident and the subsequent investigation and report, two specific changes were made in the way the X-15 program was run. First was that future flights would ensure the pilot had all of his pitch, roll, yaw, heading, and angle of attack information, and that a telemetry channel to NASA One would provide these same data to the controllers on the ground in real time. Even though the X-15 continued to fly for nearly a year, the heart of the program had been shattered, along with Mike Adams and X-15 number 3. Funding existed through the end of 1968, but no one wanted to push their luck anymore before it was finished. X-15 crew chief Charlie Baker said, "We were a nice little team, a family. You knew all the pilots. It was a glorious thing until that day. When you lose one of your family, you lose part of yourself." Out of the 3 rocket planes, only the number 1 ship was left to finish out the program. Once the investigation was completed, the broken remains of X-15 number 3 were sanctioned to be buried in an unmarked grave in the desert near Edwards. For Mike, his legacy is that the flight test community learned a powerful lesson in safety. 10 years before his last mission, pilots seemed to be throwaway items out at the base. Almost every week, someone was being replaced after one crash or another. A decade later, losing a pilot to an in-flight accident was a rarity. Unfortunately, these lessons were apparently not transferred to the space shuttle program, later costing 2 very expensive vehicles and 2 irreplaceable crews. When a tragedy strikes, the exact moment becomes a fixed point in time, one which never diminishes in memory. Charles Gerdell, Mike's best friend, was crossing the 8th Street Bridge in Sacramento when he heard the news on the radio. Mike's brother George was in an attorney's office. I got a phone call there from a military spokesman, and he informed me of the fatal accident. It was a severe shock. Suddenly, you're having to cope with something that heretofore was not possible. It's like anything else. You don't think it's going to happen to him or to you. A memorial service was held at the Edwards Base Chapel on Saturday, 18 November at 3 p.m. Chaplain Roy gave the eulogy, intoning, "The flight testing profession has lost a dedicated pilot, and the United States Air Force has sustained a great loss." He gave his life doing the thing he most wanted to do. It was a sentiment echoed by Charles when he said, "Mike loved that plane. We hated to see him go, but he died doing something he loved. I couldn't imagine Mike ending up in an old folks' home someday." The memorial concluded and the people filed outside for a last tribute as a group of Edwards Flight Test Center pilots flew a formation of jet fighters over the chapel, one of the planes pulling up sharply as they passed overhead in tribute to the missing man. Within just a few weeks, Frida and her children had to vacate their home at Edwards. She chose to move the family to Louisiana rather than to Sacramento. Her roots were in the South. "You go right back to your own people," she told me firmly. Mike also went with her to be interred close by. Frida thought it was the right thing to do. The family in Sacramento didn't argue, she said. Frida always remained close to Mike's family and often crossed the country to visit. Frida settled in Monroe, Louisiana, returned to college to finish her master's degree, where she also met her future second husband, George, a college professor who specialized in theater arts. "I loved working in my flower garden. You just didn't get to do that at Edwards." Mike's X-15 flight had been scheduled for an altitude of 250,000 feet, but his peak altitude ended up being 266,000 feet. These extra 3 miles made a lot of difference in one very specific respect. In the 1960s, the US Air Force held the official position that any pilot who exceeded 50 miles was to be considered an astronaut. On 15 November 1967, Mike Adams accomplished this goal in the X-15 with less than half a mile to spare. In the end, his dream of entering space had finally been realized. On Tuesday, 16 January 1968, Frida made the 80-mile trek west to Barksdale Air Force Base. There, with a little ceremony, she received her husband's silver Air Force astronaut wings. It was a status for her husband which Frida would have preferred to forego if Mike could have instead returned alive from his flight. "You can't help but be bitter when you have to go through something like that," she said. "Just think of what might have been." Looking back at her years with Mike, she had regrets, but also wonderful memories. We had a good life and all. When he would go out early, he'd fly over our house and wave those wings, and I was out there to see him go by. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Badelsky now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life. One evening, not long before his final flight, Mike Adams decided to take his 2 boys, Mike Jr. and Brent, along with nephew David, out to the NASA hangar at Edwards for a private tour of the area where their father and uncle worked. At the time of this nocturnal visit to the hangar, it was filled with a wide variety of experimental aircraft in all sorts of strange shapes and colors. Adams let the boys explore and even opened up some of the aircraft so they could sit in the cockpits to pretend they were flying at high Mach numbers themselves. Remembering his long ago childhood, a giant grin appeared as Brent recalled the magical night with his father. "I believe all 3 X-15s were in there that particular night. I'll never forgive that." Dave said, "I remember walking beneath the B-52 as we entered the area, and it was just amazing to have done that. I remember that so vividly. It really left an impression on me." I asked Brent which image is the first to come to mind when he speaks of his father. It would be with his flight suit on, out there standing on the lake bed. If there was a second image, it would be fishing or something, maybe up at Lake Tahoe. This image of Mike out in the forest or on a lake is the way so many of his family and friends remember him, although the public image was always of a serious man standing stiff and unsmiling next to the X-15. Mike was much more than that. Bill Dana related, he was just a big bear of a guy. Mike was really laid back compared to the average test pilot. He was running at max who was running at max gain all the time. He was just different from the other guys on the program. With all Mike had gone through, from losing the NASA astronaut selection due to the F-104 ejection injury, becoming frustrated with the lack of progress on Mole to the point of leaving that program, and finally being selected to fly as one of the elite test pilots on the X-15, maybe in the end he found his heart being drawn in a different direction. Perhaps inner peace for Mike Adams would not have been in outer space, but in the backcountry of America. Dana shared a thought that opened a tiny window into the soul of Mike Adams. He talked like he was ready to get out of the Air Force and go be a forest ranger. I don't think he actually would have done it, but that's what he claimed he wanted to do, go be a forest ranger. Maybe Mike would have chosen this new path and been exceptionally good at it if fate had not intervened so tragically that day. Thank you for being here for Michael Adams. I've been honored to share his life story with you. I hope you'll remember Mike the next time you look up into space on a clear night. Good day to you all. If you have any questions about Mike or the X-15, I would be more than happy to answer them for you. Thank you again, Eleanor, for having me come in today.
Michelle, that was a phenomenal presentation. I learned so many things about Mike I did not know previously. And a couple questions I have right off the top. I had thought that the accident was due. I knew that Mike had become distracted in the cockpit, but for some reason I thought that it was because of a unfamiliarity perhaps with a modified cockpit display. But obviously from what you were told us, that was not really the case. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Sure. As I said, it was, after the flight when they really realized what a stupid thing they'd done. There was that indicator that they had moved right into the center of the cockpit display. And it was just a simple needle. And it was just at certain points in the system, you could switch different switches and make that needle represent different things. And so what they were trying to do was that they could actually have it indicate, as I mentioned in the program, pitch or yaw. It could also indicate a G reading. If they were trying to maintain a G load, the pilot would just sit there and center that needle. If they wanted to keep a certain yaw or pitch, they would just center that needle as long as the switch was in the right position. But then you got this stupid computer off and on 61 different times. It kept flashing on and off, and he just forgot where that switch position was. And so he was reading it wrong. And so many of the people I talked to that worked on the X-15 or were pilots on the X-15 were they were livid at themselves for allowing something like that to get put into the cockpit. And it was a terrible thing, recriminations to themselves over that for so long. I mean, I interviewed some of these guys decades after the incidents, and they were still, just very terribly affected by that one simple decision, which could have changed everything if they had not done that.
Wow. We do have a question actually from the chat. Did other X-15 pilots' wives and family attend their flights in the NASA control room? Curious about that. And then a second question, how did they determine the yaw roll was set wrong?
Well, let me go with the second one first. It was fairly simple after the flight that they could see where the switch position was in the wreckage. They also had a camera that was running. There's a camera right over the shoulder of the pilot in the cockpit that was recording the instrument readings. So they were able to recover that camera and the film from the camera, which is an amazing story in itself of how they were able to recover that film, find it out in the middle of the desert and process it and use that to be able to really figure out exactly what was happening 10th of a second by 10th of a second through all of this. So they could actually see on the camera film the switch position of what was going on. They could also see the flashing of the computer malfunction light, things like that. So they could really piece it together very well. As for other people being out there at the control room, it actually was not a normal circumstance that other family members would be out there. I don't recall any of the other family members, wives, sons, daughters, ever talking about being out there watching the flights unfold as they unfolded. Frida was really unusual in that, and she was just there from day one. I think it came out of that idea that if you remember, I was talking about when he first applied for the astronaut program, she was not really on board when he was doing that. And so it was after losing that when she came to that realization that, hey, you know, I need to get behind him. I need to support what he wants to do. And she was 100% behind him from that point on. And I think that's one of the things that drove her to saying, you know, I'm going to be there supporting him on the lake bed, in the control room, whatever it was. It was also much later in the program when this was occurring. So again, people said, hey, it's no big deal. We know what we're doing out here. Sure, people can be sitting around in the control room. It's no problem.
Yeah, I was particularly struck as well, and I never really made the connection before about this accident having so many parallels in terms of sort of that routine perception, the complacency that clearly is a red thread that goes right straight to Challenger and Columbia. And I never really thought about that before. So that
it was something that, you know, it struck me when you look at the things that happened. There's so many other aspects of the accident, which I didn't really get into. You know, I could talk about, you know, all the factors, the chain of events leading to this. And I could take up all of your evenings so long for that. But there were so many red flags all along the way. And when you compare that to Challenger and especially Columbia, my God, after we lost Challenger, so many of the exact same things happened that led to the Columbia accident, this whole complacency and stuff. And it really could be traced back to that. I had some people saying when I wrote the book, it's like, oh, you're just going to write, you know, a love letter to the X-15. It's going to be a fan book or something. And it's like, no, I think I had to write in the case, especially of Mike Adams, was a very critical review of the program. And these are lessons that, my God, I hope people start learning this stuff. How many people have to die before we learn that if you start seeing something wrong, darn it, say something.
Yeah. Let me ask one other question and we can open it up for more questions. Correct me if I'm wrong, that the X-15 number 3 was buried out in the high desert, but it's in a non-disclosed location. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never been able to get anybody that can tell me where it is. I have no idea who actually did the disposal of the vehicle. And so I've never been able to find somebody that says, yeah, I know where it is, but I'm not going to tell you. However, with that said, there are still pieces of that aircraft that do exist. You know, they took all of the remains of the vehicle and put them in a hangar at Edwards. They did exactly the same kind of forensic evidence like you saw with Columbia and Challenger, where they took all the pieces and laid them out trying to put the thing together again to see where things went wrong and stuff. They did that same thing with the X-15. And so some of those pieces ended up not being gathered and buried out in the desert. Some of them were actually thrown into trash cans. And I was very lucky in the fact that one of the people that I know knew someone. He worked on the X-15 himself, but a friend of his who worked on the X-15 had found some of these pieces from the vehicle that were thrown in a trash can, and he retrieved them and kept them for all these years. He'd actually tried to give them to the Air Force Museum and the Smithsonian to have for their collections, and they turned them down. And Dave finally talked him into giving him to me. And a friend of mine just built this really beautiful display case and stuff. I have a wing thruster and a nose thruster from the X-15 that are mounted in this really gorgeous display case that my friend Bob Klein built. And so I use that when I'm doing local stuff where I can put stuff in the car and just drive to it. I have this stuff out so people can see it. And I've also gotten some other things that have been donated to me over the years from retirees and people who've actually bequeathed things to me after the program was over. So I have a piece of a wing spar that's probably about a foot and a half long that a friend of mine had mounted and everything that was recovered from the crash. So at least there are some pieces still out there that we can show to people and remind them what had happened that day.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to mention one of the last trips I made before what I call the before times, before COVID. I had the opportunity to come out to California, and Michelle and her wife joined me and a friend of mine who lives in Lancaster out that direction for a personal tour of the high desert. So that was really quite wonderful. And I didn't realize when we saw Balls 8 there right on the Edwards that carried the X-15 number 3. I didn't realize that. So I want to thank you again. And we did see the site, the memorial site, which was quite moving as well. So again, thank you. It's a vivid memory for me.
Oh, you're most welcome. I love doing these tours and stuff. That tour that we did, that was actually the last travel that Cherie and I did before the pandemic shut down. So that holds a special place for us as well. And I've taken other people out to many of those sites just to let the people who are on here today know, if they just go to my website, mach25media.com, you'll see the X-15 on there. You click on that, it takes you directly to my X-15 index page. There are tons and tons of photographs, a lot more information about the Adams accident, but obviously a lot of stuff on the X-15. I've got over 2,800 photographs available on the site, but also up at the top of that page, you'll find several PDF downloads that you can do. 2 of those downloads are what I call the In the Footsteps of the X-15 tour. And one is a set of maps and another is a description of taking the tour, which is what we did a partial of that day when we went out to see B-52 number 8 and things like that, and out to the memorial. So you can download those and see, you can actually tour around all these sites that are examples of what happened with the X-15 and where these things happened.
Yeah, fantastic. By the way, where did you get all the photographs? Were those given to you by the family? And I also wondered, is Frida still with us? Obviously, you did have a chance to interview several members of the family and friends.
Yeah, I spoke to his brother George. I spoke with his son Brent and Mike Jr., and also with Frida. I never did get to meet their third daughter, Lise. Unfortunately, one of these days, maybe I'll still get to meet her. She's somewhere in Texas working with Schlumberger, and also his friend Charles Gerdell and his cousin, Brent's cousin, Dave. And all of them were very, very helpful to me and stuff. And they were really wonderful. I actually drove down to Monroe, Louisiana, where Frida and Brent and Mike Jr. were at the time. That was, oh my God, that was 15 years ago now when I spoke to them. And talk about the Southern hospitality. I mean, they really rolled out the red carpet for me. Frida, a wonderful Southern belle, as we say, insisted I stay with them at the house, cooked me dinner, just wonderful. You saw a couple of photographs that I had there, a shot of her with the wings, Mike's wings, and also the artifacts. That was all taken in her living room that day that I interviewed her. And Brent, we've met several times. He's been out to the memorial. You saw that picture with him and Dave at the memorial. That was in 2017 on the 50th anniversary when we honored Mike's life on the day that he died 50 years later. That was also the first time I ever was able to make this presentation about Mike. So talk about being under pressure. Mike and Brent and Dave sitting there in the front row when I was doing this presentation for the very first time. And I was like, if I say anything wrong, they're going to come up on stage and break my neck or something. But they were both absolutely wonderful people, and they loved the presentation, and I was very glad of that. And Frida is still with us. She's in her mid-90s now. So I don't know how long she's going to be with us, but as of this time, she still is. The sad thing to report is that Mike Jr. is not. Mike, he never fully recovered from his father's death. And he basically went through life almost aimless after that. He just never had a focus. And extremely sad to report that he committed suicide several years ago. And so he's no longer with us. So, yeah, just a terrible, terrible tragedy on so many levels.
Absolutely. Well, I've been asking a lot of questions. Anyone else have any questions for Michelle? Feel free to unmute yourself or put questions in the chat.
Yeah. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation tonight. As I say, it's always an honor to speak about Mike. He's, not many people know him. As I said at the very first of the presentation, he's the very first American astronaut ever lost in the commission of a space flight. So just getting his story out there, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, and I also didn't know that he had applied to be an astronaut, had been one of the candidates for the MOL program either. So that was new to me, but I am glad he got his astronaut wings. So
yes, yeah, unfortunately posthumously.
Yeah.
And unfortunately too, the Air Force almost did it grudgingly. It was really terrible. All the other X-15 pilots had big ceremonies. The Air Force X-15 pilots, when they got their wings, there were 5 Air Force pilots that got astronaut wings, and they made a big deal about it. And when it came to Mike, as I mentioned in here, it's just like, oh, well, we're just gonna, we'll give them to you over here at Barksdale, just come by and pick them up. And they took a couple pictures, and that was about it. It was really terrible how Frida was treated in that way.
Yeah, quite unfortunate.
Yeah.
All right, well, I don't think there's any additional questions, but again, fabulous talk this evening. Really want to thank you for that, Michelle. And you're always welcome back to our webinars, or maybe back live someday to warm.
I'd love to be there. Oh man, when I was out there to do my X-15 presentation and getting to stand under the fuge and going upstairs and actually climbing into the gondola, this is the place where these X-15 pilots learn to fly the X-15 with their first simulations and stuff in the fuge. That was an amazing day, and I thank you so much for having me out there to do that. And I would love to come back to the fuge someday and do that again. That's something else, and it is just amazing with the history that you help bring to life through this webinar series and the in-person stuff that you've done in the past and will do in the future. And I can't thank you enough for what you do and all the people that support you and what you're doing with the Southeast Pennsylvania Cold War Society. This is just amazing and wonderful.
All right, thank you. All right. Well, with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up this evening's webinar. Please join us again next month on November 18th. So not the second Thursday, but the third Thursday of the month. for a talk about the Minuteman program with David Stumpf. So thanks again, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and thanks again, Michelle.
Oh, thank you so much, Eleanor. If anybody does contact you with any questions, feel free to forward them to me. I'm glad to answer anything I can.
All right, fabulous.
All
All right,
right.
thank you. All right, we'll
Take
see everyone
care.
next month.
Bye.
Bye-bye.